Good evening, everyone. We on? My name's Nick Fike, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's author event with Sean Kelly, discussing his latest book, The Game. One moment. Okay. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation acknowledges Wadawurrung and the Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which their library services operate. They pay respect to Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar's elders, past and present, and they acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations people of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. And I'd also like to add my support for, I think it's important not just to acknowledge these things, but to show support in a political sense for the voice which has been proposed, Uluru Voice, and for the constitutional recognition of the First Nations people. Thanks for joining us tonight. Some brief housekeeping reminders before we begin our discussion. You can participate in this live webinar by clicking on the Q&A button and typing your question or comment. You may need to touch your screen first to see the Q&A function pop up if you're using an iPad or iPhone. Also, this webinar is being recorded. If you'd like to watch this discussion again or to recommend it to friends or family, it'll upload to the library's YouTube channel within the next couple of days. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to provide a little background about myself. I'm the editor of the monthly magazine. As a writer, I've contributed various political and current affairs related pieces to The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, the Saturday paper and the monthly. And I've worked with Sean Kelly many times in the past. I'm really pleased to have been invited to facilitate this evening's events with Sean. Sean's a columnist for the 9 papers and a regular contributor to the monthly. He was a political advisor to Kevin Rudd and to Julia Gillard. And tonight we'll be discussing his book, The Game, which gives us the definitive portrait of Scott Morrison. It's rare that a book becomes more true after it's published, but the portrait Sean paints of our current Prime Minister has seemed to become more insightful and accurate as the weeks have rolled on. Sean picks up on traits that some observers had noticed, but that few had examined in depth. By now, his character assessment has been read by most of the press gallery, among other people, of course, and it's already seeped into the media consciousness, into the public consciousness, colouring the coverage of the biggest stories in Australian politics. You can see traces of it everywhere, as the series of questions, fears, criticisms about Morrison surface across the public domain, along with the growing awareness of his motives and methods. Sean's book is the most interesting and enlightening book about Australian politics that I've had the pleasure of reading in the last few years, in fact. And it's about so much more than just Scott Morrison. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk with him this evening. Sean, good evening. How are you?
Good evening. I'm well.
Oh, that's great. Your book has a really interesting form. I'm going to start asking you about the book, and then I think we'll talk through, onto more contemporary issues and Morrison himself. But I wanted to talk to you about the writing of the book. It's not a biography in any conventional sense. There's no chronology of Morrison's life and career. And in some ways, you'd say it's actually a series of essays. Why did you decide to write it this way?
Well, in some ways, it came about through the barriers, I suppose, in front of the writing. And by that, I mean, first of all, that Scott Morrison hadn't done an awful amount when I started writing the book. Now, I mean, he still hasn't. Obviously, he's had to manage the pandemic, and there's debate around that. But he hasn't had a great appetite throughout his career for achieving an enormous amount in policy terms. And some of the audience won't know, I was commissioned to write an article about Scott Morrison by Nick a few years ago in 2018, just after he became Prime Minister. And it was quite a difficult article to write because typically, if you're trying to write about a politician, you look at a couple of things about them. You look at what they've done, and you look at what they believe. And Scott Morrison hadn't done an awful amount, and he didn't seem to have any very clear beliefs either. He spoke in generalities. When he occasionally said something specific, he contradicted himself elsewhere. So it was very difficult to find marks against either of those categories in the ledger. And eventually, after staring at this for quite some time, I realized that that was the key to Scott Morrison, that there weren't traces of him, that he'd spent an entire career making sure that there was no simple definition of him, nothing that anybody could grab hold of. And what that means, I think, with Scott Morrison is that you need to look very closely at what he has said, work very closely at what he's said and what he hasn't said, and how he hasn't said those things. So in a sense, what you're looking at, I think, there is performance. And you're looking at politics as literature, in a sense, as an assemblage of words, and how those words are put together to convey meaning, to hook into meanings that already exist in the culture, or to avoid meaning altogether. And so I think if you're going to pay that much attention to the things that somebody says in a way that takes you away from the basic facts of their life, and then you have another factor which also comes in the form of a barrier, which is the fact that I don't find Scott Morrison's life that interesting, and that perhaps there's some problem with me there. Perhaps there's some snobbishness there. Perhaps his life isn't that interesting. But what that led me to was to say no when somebody first approached me about writing a book about Scott Morrison. And it was a very similar process for me to writing that article for you, Nick, which is that eventually I realized that barrier, the idea that Scott Morrison was boring, was actually the key to writing it. You think that this thing is standing in your way, but actually if you just press on it, you can walk through that door. And in this case, I began to ask myself, how was it that this man who had become prime minister in quite unusual circumstances, who had won an election that nobody expected him to win, was still seen by so many Australians as boring? And I began to ask, how had Scott Morrison pulled that trick off? Why had he pulled that trick off? What use was boredom in politics? And also, why did we allow that to happen? Why weren't we more interested in Scott Morrison? So I think those three things together pushed me towards an analysis of Morrison that was, a little bit veering towards literary criticism rather than straight biography.
Yeah, it really is almost a work of literary criticism. And you sort of identify his key traits and these key sort of themes of his character, and then you work through them across the chapters. Did you choose quite early on how you would structure it, or did the structure did those traits reveal themselves the more you looked into him?
Some of them were there from that early piece that I wrote for you, but no, others came along were real, light bulb moments.
Tell us about some of those, the things that sort of changed that you learned as you wrote.
Well, one of them was I was reading James Wood, the literary critic James Wood, on characters, and he talks about flat characters and round characters, and he's drawing there on the work of the novelist Ian Forster. And Forster says that in a novel, a round character is a real person. It's somebody with nuance. It's somebody who might surprise us, who is complex and complicated. Whereas a flat character, often a comic character, is somebody who is incredibly simple, simply drawn, that is. You can describe them in a sentence or two. They often have a catchphrase. They have a striking visual characteristic. And when I read that certainly registered with me. I began to see that Scott Morrison was in many ways a flat character. And that's not necessarily a description of his personality. It's a recognition of the way that he has chosen to present himself to the Australian people. Now, he definitely wouldn't use that analogy, but I'm absolutely certain that he understood the utility of presenting himself as a flat character to the Australian public. And so you got this very, very simply drawn bloke, this guy who liked curries, and who liked rugby league, followed the Sharks obsessively.
So his understanding is based on a kind of recognition that in today's media, people will only be able to remember a certain number of things about you. And so I guess he thinks, well, what are the 5 things I want, the public to know about me? I'm a daggy dad. I cook curries on the weekend, Sharks, go Sharks. And so I think quite plausibly you go through the construction of these, and it really does kind of start around 2015, 2014, that these characteristics start to emerge. In fact, he wasn't even a rugby league fan before then, and then suddenly he's the biggest rugby league fan. It's an amazing thing for a political leader to aspire to, because you're right, it is a flat character, but for a political leader to say, I just want to be known as a pen portrait, a few small things. I don't want to be a rounded character for the Australian public. What does it say about us?
Well, that's true. I mean, it says, I think, that we have quite a superficial approach to politics and are quite content to take a superficial approach to politics. And I don't think Australia is unique in that, though I think it's perhaps more accentuated here. I think we are a nation that for many reasons allows most people to tune out of politics for much of the time. And various prime ministers, conservative prime ministers, have noted that. Fraser, Abbott, Morrison have all had versions of the phrase, getting politics off the front page, letting people forget about politics, getting sport back onto the front page. So I think it does say something about us there. But then I think there's this second element to it, which is interesting, I think, which is that we do know on some level that there's a bit of artifice there. We understand that Scott Morrison is presenting us with an image, but I think these days we're very accepting of that idea. We kind of shrug our shoulders and say, well, of course, everyone presents images. Politicians have to present images. And this is something I get into in more detail in the book, but I think this is a real problem with our approach to politics today, that we forgive an awful lot of artifice because we think we're so knowing. But what that really means is that we let politicians off the hook. We let them get away with superficialities. We let them get away with performances and pretense. And we kind of feel special being included and knowing that that's going on. But I don't think that actually helps us to hold them accountable at all. Scott Morrison actually does this thing that I think is quite amazing in his main election ad in the 2019 election. It starts with his daughters having one of those directors, clapboards, action boards, and they clap it together and they call action. And then it goes into this very obviously contrived shot of the Morrison family walking along a veranda at Kirribilli House. And of course, the whole ad is that type of artifice, and there are, genuine on some level, but obviously concocted for the cameras on another level, shots of the family cooking and whatnot. But by doing that at the start, by having that, having that clapboard moment, Morrison is in effect saying, "You guys know this is an act. You know that this is performance." But he brings us in on it.
Yeah.
And so I think we forgive him a lot in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's because we sort of accept modern politics is like that. And I was rereading this section today where you say that we kind of assume that if there's this artificial aspect of his presentation, that there's a kind of implication that there is a real Scott Morrison behind there. Well, that's the way you generally talk about people presenting a picture of themselves, that there's an assumption that underneath all this, there's a real Scott Morrison. And in a way, you kind of, I'd be interested to know what you kind of think now, because I guess the book is the search for the real Scott Morrison. And, without sort of giving away the ending, there's part of it is like you're saying, what's real at that moment is the real Scott Morrison. He is constantly changing, constantly flipping. He can say the opposite things in the same paragraph and believe them both times. Have you sort of reached any further conclusions on whether there is a sort of real Scott Morrison, like, that's hidden away that we don't know about, that's at the kind of core of him?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky question, and in a way, the first question I think one has to ask about it is how important is that question in in accessing politics, and it's something I've struggled with because on one hand, I do think who a politician really is does tell us things, and we have a right to know in a sense. And on the other hand, I think that often that search for a real politician beneath the images can act as a kind of alibi, can act as a bit of an excuse where we say, well, this performance they're putting on, that's not the real politician. I think we often do it around asylum seeker policy, for example. Both major parties have been acted pretty cynically and horribly around asylum seeker policy over a number of years. And I think we often kind of say, well, I mean, of course, they don't really mean that. That's not really who they are as people. That's just who they know they have to perform as in order to get votes. But I think we let them off the hook. But to come back to your question, I think a couple of things, and they might seem a little bit at odds with each other. The first is that if you perform any role for long enough, it is you. It is you either because it becomes you over time, or because you have instinctively been performing, perhaps exaggerating, something that was always in you the whole time. So I think if you have done something consistently, and Scott Morrison's habits, his political habits, his public habits, are consistent over a very long period of time, then I don't think you can separate that performance from the real person. And then I also think that there is a very private Scott Morrison in a couple of spheres of his life, attached to his family and attached to his religion. And perhaps understandably, I don't think we'll ever get a real insight into that private Scott Morrison. I think he's protective of those domains. Now, whether that's whether that's important, whether there's a gap between the way he talks about those things publicly and the fact that he tries to keep them private in other ways, I guess those are topics that are arguable. But I suppose that's my answer to your question. It's not a simple one. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, no. It's interesting though that you who've looked closer at Scott Morrison than anyone over the past few years, and you've written this incredibly kind of nuanced, detailed, interesting book that we can talk about so much about Scott Morrison. We have all watched him closely for the past 3 years, and yet I defy anyone to tell me what his views are on about 90% of the policy issues that a prime minister has to look after. His personal views on important kind of policy issues are just nowhere. Like, he'll decide one thing and then he'll, if it's popular, he'll say the opposite. It's kind of amazing that the things that you've drawn out, the things that you've found are consistent, none of them are policy related. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I think the argument has been made to me that Morrison is fun. If you could identify a consistent strain, it is that Morrison is very instinctively a small government man. And there is probably some truth to that, in that I don't think he really believes that government should do much at all. But also he's quite happy for government to do heaps and heaps and heaps if it will help him politically. So it's not, there might be things that he believes on some level, but they're not borne out in his actions. So I think this brings me back to the topic we were discussing a few minutes ago about the idea of a politician's private self being sometimes an alibi for the way they behave. I mean, I could probably say Scott Morrison believes in small government, but what does that mean? What does that mean to say somebody believes in something if they don't actually follow through on that belief when they have the opportunity to do so? I'm not sure that it means very much at all. So, no. And, I think the interesting thing there, Nick, is that, of the people who've written books about Scott Morrison, and there are three of them now, I think all have reached pretty similar conclusion on that front. I don't see anybody out there identifying consistent strains of policy belief on Scott Morrison's behalf.
No, and look, we're heading into, and we'll move into the sort of contemporary moment in a few minutes, but we're looking towards an election probably in May, and it's still extremely difficult to say what he wants to be prime minister for. As in, I'm not sure why he wants to be prime minister now, let alone, what's the picture that he's presenting to Australia for why he should be the prime minister? I literally I don't actually know what his answer to that question is. I know that he thinks he knows what persona might get him into the prime ministership.
Mm.
But do you feel like you have a sense of what motivates him in this job?
I think, here I have to say, I think this can probably be said of a lot of politicians. I think it is I think it's an ego-based thing. I think it is a fundamental belief that he is the best person. So it's not about wanting to achieve anything. It's not about politics as a means to some end. It is about the notion that the country will have a prime minister and that he can do that job better than anyone else. And I suspect there are a bunch of politicians in all of the parties who are in politics for that reason. And, I think our society in some ways encourages a kind of rootless ambition, if you like.
Oh, and look across the Anglosphere. I don't think it's a coincidence that Boris Johnson and Donald Trump were all elected at basically the same time. I think, we have a political system that rewards, people who have a kind of shameless, shameless flexibility in their views, large ego, a capacity to be really completely freewheeling. Yeah.
Yeah, and all three men are, have some knowledge of performance. I think it was Bernard Keane who pointed out, Trump was a reality television star, Johnson was a journalist, Morrison was a marketing and ad guy. In different ways, were all concerned with image and or storytelling in their previous careers. And that is what those leaderships have been constructed around. They're not about policy in any sense, except exactly as you explained it before, except as a means to convince people that they are the persona that they've adopted.
Yeah. How did you, because your piece is such a sort of textual analysis, you spend a lot of time looking at the coverage of Morrison, about how this was received. I think it's become clear, and we sort of know who he is a bit more now, and I think your book has helped clarify this for a lot of people. And I think people have sort of pegged him a little bit now, but I'd be interested to know what your view of the media's coverage of him in the first kind of few years of his leadership was like. Did it contribute to his success, their sort of lack of awareness of what he was doing? Were you disappointed by the media coverage? Did you think it could have been better? Would it have made a difference if they had thought about these questions more? I'd just be interested to know your view as a former kind of, media guy yourself, what your read on the media's coverage of him was.
Yeah, I think that Scott Morrison's career, in a way, is a really good case study of the failure of both sides' journalism. Failure of journalists to present facts and accountability to facts, as opposed to what politicians say and then say, well, a politician has said that, so we have a responsibility to treat that as one legitimate half of the story. Scott Morrison's career, as you rightly identified, Nick, essentially falls in two halves. There was the half before 2015 when he essentially kept a blank slate, didn't really want to fill in the blanks at all, didn't say much about himself. And then after 2015, and 2015 is the first year that he begins to be spoken of as a serious leadership contender. And there's some sense that he might be the guy to take over from Tony Abbott rather than Malcolm Turnbull. And that's when he begins to talk about curries. He begins to talk about ScoMo. He begins to tweet again about rugby league after not having done so for the previous 18 months. So begins very busily constructing this persona, and that persona turns out not to be so useful to him for another 3 years. But 2015 in a sense is a very good dress rehearsal. And I think the way that he described himself was pretty uncritically accepted. He began to use the word pragmatic about himself all the time for 3 or 4 years. And that found its way into news reports. And it's not an entirely terrible word to use about a politician. One journalist can use it, another journalist can use it, fine. But then suddenly it's everywhere. And that's not an accident. And that is on some level, I think, the way that reporting often spreads. Somebody reads something else that somebody's written. That word gets stuck in their mind. I understand that. As somebody who writes a political column each week, you're reading, of course, what everybody else has written. Things stick in your mind. There is, it's a very hard force to resist. But I think that to your question, that definitely aided Scott Morrison to an enormous extent. The use of that word pragmatic in particular, because Morrison had a real habit of backing down from beliefs, of completely switching sides. It wasn't clear what he believed. And that all became subsumed under the word pragmatic. And I think essentially because it was kind of an offensive word in a way. That's one example. But then, the rugby league, the curry cooking, they all just begin to be repeated in profiles as the most important things to know about this man. That's a pretty big call when you think about it. This guy's running to be prime minister, or to be re-elected as prime minister. Those are the most important things to know about him. I think the media did allow themselves to go along with the image of Morrison that he chose to present. And I think in some ways, some of what we're seeing now is a reaction to that.
Do you think he picks up like a new set of? Is he going to pick up like a new set of little traits? Have you noticed he's got any new ones to add to the curries and the sharkies?
No. I think he has that single image. The images of the ordinary Australian. And, one of the fascinating things that happened this last week is he didn't know, the price of milk and bread and rapid antigen tests. And obviously he thought that was a problem, because the next morning he had a whole new set of lines to combat it. And in one of those, he was asked what sort of bread he ate. And he said, just normal white bread.
Normal white bread guy, yeah.
And I'm not going to suggest that was contrived, because I'm not sure that it was. But I think that presentation of himself as the normal bloke, and as Scott Morrison, as what a normal Australian is, and perhaps should be, certainly what a normal Australian is at any rate, is central to his political persona. So I think we'll keep hearing that in one form or another.
And just before we get on to more sort of contemporary issues, I just want to ask about your view on his Pentecostalism. It's been widely discussed. I know that one of our writers, James Boyce, thinks it's a really critical part of his character, if not his public persona, that it's one of the most consistent things, and that there's a kind of radical aspect to Pentecostalism that we just don't discuss, as in this is not Catholicism. It's nothing like mainstream denominations. It's got very what a lot of modern Australians would think of are quite sort of intense views on the existence of, for example, the devil, who, you know, is real in to Pentecostals. It's a real force. They don't believe in climate change. So there's these aspects, and there's some that you could easily look at Morrison and say that this is absolutely consistent with his behaviour. Where do you fall on this kind of spectrum?
I Look, I mean, I think it's difficult when we talk about analysing people's religion and the contribution of that religion to their performance as a politician. I certainly don't think that it should be. I don't think it should necessarily be out of bounds. I guess it depends on how we treat other things. So if we decide that, if we think that the team that somebody supports in rugby league is important and tells us something about that person, if we think that the fact that a person cooks curries tells us something important about that person, then I don't think it's rocket science to also conclude that knowing a little bit more about their religion might tell us something important about a person. So I think there's a bit of there's a bit of false differentiating that goes on there. I think James has written incredibly perceptively about this topic. My greatest sense of the contribution of Pentecostalism to Scott Morrison's political career is a set of sensibilities. I think often our sensibilities, the way our mind works, the way it frames the world, is very important to the way we act. And for Morrison, the two most important things, I think, are an abiding sense of optimism that things will work out. And you can see that in the pandemic again and again and again. And I think you can perhaps see it in the sense that government doesn't need to do much, things will work out as well. So I think that kind of blind optimism is part of it. And then I think the other side is a tendency to divide the world in two, a tendency towards binaries and into good and evil. Despite the fact that he talks about bringing Australia together, he's often setting up binaries. There are the quiet Australians, and then there are the rest of the people. There are those who give a go and those who don't, and therefore who don't deserve to get a go back. And those divisions into the deserving and the undeserving, you see everywhere in Scott Morrison's political language and in his approach to politics. So I think those sensibilities are quite important. And I do think mostly people choose to leave them unexamined. There is one other important thing I think to say about religion, which is partly because we feel, we're a bit gingerly about talking about religion and politics too much and talking about people's personal beliefs too much. I think it has meant that Scott Morrison can talk about his religion and suggest very strongly that he does have a set of firm beliefs, while never actually having to answer questions about those beliefs. So there's this guy who actually hasn't had many consistent strains of conviction in his life, who nevertheless somehow manages to present himself as a man of strong convictions. And I'm not for a second suggesting that his faith is contrived. I think his faith is probably the most sincere, genuine part of him. But as with every politician, every part of their life ends up playing some sort of a political role. And I do think it plays a political role in that sense, whether that's intentional or not.
True, but he very, very, very rarely discusses the actual nature of his belief. Yeah. How do you think he's travelling at the moment, Sean?
Look, I think it's very difficult to say, Nick. Obviously, things have turned on him a great deal in about the last week. And to some extent, I think that's a bit damning of us all, anybody who follows politics, in the sense that it feels a little bit like a couple of polls shifted everybody's sense of Scott Morrison, and suddenly he's in enormous trouble. And look, on some level, the polls tell us something about the world, and maybe there's some legitimacy to that. But I can't help but think that we're letting the polls condition our sense of reality rather than the other way around.
I felt like it shifted really radically over Christmas and New Year's, actually. Like the polls felt like confirmation of what was happening out on the street. It might have been because I was one of the people with COVID, and that we couldn't get tests. but seeing queues of people, people queuing for 6 hours and just thinking and watching for weeks, like for 3-4 weeks of this outbreak happening,
Mm,
them doing nothing, 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 nothing. Like they couldn't even, they didn't even seem to put out tenders to get RATs. They had no inclination to kind of fix things. They
yeah.
didn't put out financial supports. To me, it was actually that period that really, that I sort of felt. But, look,
Mm,
I'm sure most Australians were probably trying to just relax and, not think about work and politics. But anyway, that was my
mm.
experience.
I mean, I think things have definitely shifted. They began to shift in about November, December last year. I think the Macron episode didn't, I don't think most people care two hoots about what the French president thinks, but I think it gave voice to suspicions that people were beginning to have. And then Morrison played into it a couple of times in that period. And this is what's always happened with Scott Morrison. When he hits a period of difficulty, it actually lasts. Um, he's had 4 of them now, and they last and last. And then, this year, it's not just the Omicron problems by itself. It's the various things around it, as you identify, the tests, the supply issues, and then you have the Djokovic problem. And then in the midst of the Djokovic problem, he has, it's a tiny thing in the scheme of all of these things, but he says something about the refugees in the Park Hotel not being refugees. And then immediately the next day he says, I didn't say that. And so you have another example of him saying that he hasn't said something that he has in fact very clearly said. And then, this week, he can't name the prices of things, which goes against his everyman persona. And he has this text message exchange. And so it's very, very, very early February. A lot of things have happened this year, and none of them have been good for Scott Morrison. Now, all that said, I think there are 2 things at least to bear in mind. The first is that COVID moods change very, very, very quickly. And there is a chance that we come out of Omicron and that people, flock to the pubs, and people are partying on the streets and spending money, all of the money that lots of people, not everybody, but lots of people have saved over this period. And Australia feels very different in just a month or 2. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And then
Yeah, the other thing is, one of the things is that, if we know anything about him, is we know that he's a very, very good campaigner.
Yep, absolutely. And he's likely to have the economy on his side. And, that's the one issue he will want to talk about. And the likelihood, not a certainty, but the likelihood is that the economy will be looking pretty good at that point. So on the single message that he will want to prosecute, he'll be in a good position to do so. So I wouldn't count Scott Morrison out yet. I think you'd have to say that Anthony Albanese has played the game well, if you like. But he's still he's presenting a very different model of a successful Labor opposition, and we're yet to see whether that can work. But lots of things have been different in COVID, and maybe it will be.
I'm going to throw to some of the questions that we've got, Sean, from others, because it's that time. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read the ones that are in front of us to give others a go. So if I could just encourage people watching, just press the Q&A button and put your questions in there. But I'll sort of start near the top. Deb Campbell has asked, do you think we, the voters, and also the mainstream media are becoming more aware and less accepting of the artifice of current politics in the run-up to this election? So the example that Deb gives is the Voices movement. It seems to be rising. And questions at the National Press Club recently from the media were much more strong. They were no longer giving Morrison the ropes that they did in 2019. That's a really good question, Deb. I was going to ask the same thing. What's your feeling about those questions, about giving him the rope that he had before?
I was saying last year when my book came out that I thought one of the interesting things about this election would be that it would be a testing ground in some sense for this model of performance in politics, for how long it could last. Because I think Morrison's performance and his persona served him very, very well through one election. But whether it could last an entire term, this election would be a testing ground. And right now, I think absolutely you'd have to say it's not. There is definitely less patience for it. There's definitely less patience for it in the media. The polls suggest there is less patience for it in the public. Well, I mean, no, here's where we get to the important nuance, I guess. The polls, we don't know what they suggest. We don't know what they suggest people are unhappy with exactly. It suggests that so far Morrison's performance hasn't been able to cover over the dissatisfaction with the way he's gone about things. Does it suggest dissatisfaction with the performance itself, with the nature of artifice in politics? It might not. I think we will have a stronger sense of those things depending on the election result. I'm sure a very large number of Australians are not tuned in dramatically yet still, and would still accept Scott Morrison as Scott Morrison presents himself. Is there a greater trend in our global politics towards skepticism of this model? Look, you would hope so, because I think that model, regardless of what you think of Scott Morrison and this election, I think that model of politics has massive problems with it. But our evidence for that would be Trump and Johnson's latest problems and Morrison's latest problems. But neither Morrison nor Johnson are down for the count. And also, all three of those men have been severely hurt by their handling of COVID in particular. So whether it's simply that model doesn't work in the midst of a once-in-a-century global crisis.
Yeah, exactly. There's no model. There's no control for that. I don't. We get to talk about that question for, until midnight tonight, I expect. There's a question from Harry Cham, he says, a cabinet minister allegedly described, thanks for that, Harry, allegedly described Morrison as a fraud and a complete psycho. Berejiklian allegedly called him a horrible, horrible person. Harry asked, does that gel with your understanding of the Prime Minister? And I'd also add to that, does that gel with your understanding of his colleagues' views of him?
Look, I wouldn't personally subscribe to either of those descriptions. And I don't, and I think it's important to say as well that, it is not unusual for a Prime Minister's colleagues to believe such things about them. Now, that said, it's also probably worth noting that Scott Morrison is not particularly well liked. I'm quoting other reports here. Doesn't seem particularly well liked in the Liberal Party room. I think he has got a lot of people offside over his prime ministership. One of the things that I think will be fascinating to see is if he does lose the election, whether you get a sudden flood of people putting very unflattering accounts or giving very unflattering accounts to journalists. And my suspicion would be yes. My suspicion would be that Scott Morrison is quite a intimidating Prime Minister, in the sense that he will happily go after his enemies and happily go after people who take him on.
Including people in his own party,
including people in his own party. And it's well known now that he and his office will background heavily against people who take them on, and so.
But he's got a relatively small sort of power base in the Liberal Party as well, as in, it's a smallish faction that is more or less his faction.
Yep.
And he just bolts it on to other factions when they suit him. But I wonder, I'm really interested in what happens in New South Wales over the next kind of few weeks, couple of months, because those pre-selection battles they're having seem to hint at massive dysfunction in the party. And I was thinking about that bit where you write about how his own pre-selection battles, when he was up against Michael Tauck, and then through various, people can read about it in your book, obviously, but somehow Morrison, after losing the first fight, emerges as the pre-selected candidate and then says, oh, it had nothing to do with me. And then the same thing when he became prime minister, oh, it just happened to kind of come up through the middle and it was like magic, he became the prime minister. And it was funny hearing him talk about factional battles yesterday. He was talking about New South Wales and he said something like, oh, these factional games, why don't people stop them, or something like that. It's just rubbish. Like it's not him running his game.
Yeah.
It's hilarious. It had nothing to do with him. It's literally his guy, Alex Hawke. He's the guy who's wrecking everything. He's preventing big deals between other factions. Anyway, it was funny seeing this. This is what I meant with your book becomes truer over time.
The other funny thing about the New South Wales stuff I was thinking today is that Morrison's pre-selection, of course, was in 2007. And there was a real sense when he didn't get pre-selected that John Howard had lost his grip on the New South Wales party. And, you know, of course, Howard went on to lose the 2007 election. And there's a little bit of a sense of deja vu there.
Yeah. Anonymous attendee has asked if you think Anthony Albanese is also a flat character.
Look, that's a good question. Probably a harder one for me to answer because I have known Albanese. You know, I've worked with him previously a while ago now, but you know, I do know him. So, and I think this is the thing about flat characters and round characters. Round characters can be people you know, and then some public figures. And I think politicians a while ago did present as round figures, or were more willing to present nuance. At any rate, I think you can even see that, by the way, with interviews with John Howard. I think you see a much more rounded figure than we've lately become accustomed to. It's a really interesting question because Albanese obviously is aware, and I think is probably increasingly aware, judging by his media appearances, that he does need to hammer home the same points again and again.
It's funny, isn't it? He's like Albanese and Morrison borrowed from each other terribly. Terrible plagiarists. Albo and ScoMo, their rugby league kind of credentials, and funny, and even the way that they sort of package themselves. Jan Scandalbury asked, "Do you think? What do you think will be the effect of Morrison's failure to address the so-called women problem in the election outcome?" That's a great question, and I'd add, do you think he understands that problem?
I don't think he understands the dimensions of it. I don't think he understands what it really means, other than a lot of women are annoyed with him. I don't think he quite grasps it. And I think that comes through again and again in the way he actually deals with the issue, or issues, I should say. I wrote quite a long time ago that one of the things that could happen to Morrison at this election is that he could just frustrate enough groups that, added together, they turf him out. And I do feel like that is still a real possibility. You know, he's almost systematically alienated a number of groups, and women are obviously the largest of those groups. I think the other impact it's had is to draw attention to his problem with empathy. And I think that's a greater problem than just a problem for women, or I think that's been a greater problem in terms of the way that people look at Scott Morrison.
Yeah, he never really seems to have got anywhere near solving that issue. It's really the last thing that you would say about him. He clearly has great empathy for that very middle white-bread Australian family, as in he understands those concerns, those lives. But beyond that, yeah, you just see so little evidence that he understands other people's experiences, to the point where sometimes I think there's something slightly sociopathic about his inability to understand other people's problems, like the way that he would talk about the Brittany Higgins situation. And, you know, it was only through Jen talking to him and saying, imagine if it was your daughter. That seems to be the only way that he could understand the situation. I've seen that a few times. I think it's a pretty serious problem for a leader. I mean, but that's you know, that's us who are watching very closely. Um, yeah,
Yeah, but I think there is a I think there is a general question about his ability to imagine, you know, his way into other people's lives. And look, lots of people have that problem. I don't think I don't think it's a unique um, problem at all. I think, but I think it's an issue when you're talking about the prime minister, because I think the job of a prime minister one of the jobs is to be able to do that, because you're having to govern for a very wide range of people, most of whom are not like you. And so if you kind of project your identity onto the world and act as though people are all like you, then I think it severely limits your ability to govern for the country. So I don't think it's an incredibly unique trait. I think if you came across Scott Morrison in real life and you noticed that about him, I'm not sure it would make a great impression. I think it's as a prime minister that it's a real failing, personally.
yeah. There's a related question here from Heather De Cruz. It's a bit lengthy, but I'll read it because it's a good one. Given Scott Morrison said he thinks government should stay out of people's lives, it says he doesn't have any sort of policy agenda, which we've discussed. However, is he subtly using the prime ministership to socially engineer our social institutions to the extent that they can never be reversed, like undermining and gutting the public service, and to which I'd add, or Heather adds, gutting universities and reshaping academic research as purely a money-making exercise with implications for a whole range of disciplines? Doesn't this entrench the sort of inequality that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean,
So
yeah.
I guess the other question is, do you think this narrow worldview that he has is doing permanent damage?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question, and some people would accuse me of naivety in saying this. But I'm not sure it's a really, you know, systematic attempt to dismantle those things so much as it comes back to this lack of empathy and uh, a hostility in a way to people who grapple with ideas, who are more interested in ideas and are less interested in I guess money in a way. You know, Scott Morrison, the way he talks about people's lives, and I understand this is true for a lot of people, but the way he talks about people's lives, when he lists off the things they do through a life, they are all about earning money in one form or another. And sometimes he'll mention having a family, but everything else is about earning money, earning enough for your retirement, etc. And these are important things, of course, but I think it's a very particular view of a life. And similarly, when he does try to talk about ideas, he's not very good at it. He often talks in a very confused fashion, and so I think again we're just seeing this inability to conceptualize life as anything other than the life that he is used to people leading, and that means that money is taken away from those areas, but I think it'd be a more personal antipathy towards them rather than a kind of felt ideological commitment. But it's just a hunch.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, when you wrote about his maiden speech in Parliament, and there's a section in it, and this is leading to a related question here. He seemed to be quite genuine in his maiden speech about First Nations people, about recognition, Indigenous recognition. But he's really done nothing on this, and he has no interest in revisiting it. He seems, in fact, in recent times to be much more strongly trying to identify himself as the guy who lives in the Shire that Captain Cook sailed into, you know, that he identifies with the convicts in the First Fleet.
Mm.
Do you Do you think he ever believed in this issue?
I think that he probably has some type of muddled goodwill towards the idea, the very broad and vague idea of reconciliation, and of acknowledging our past, but again, in some broad way. And I think that the difficulty is that these terms ultimately, if you're going to do something about them, have to have specificity. And the Indigenous community have been very clear about the specifics in this case. And they're all in the Uluru Statement, which takes you all of about 2 minutes to read. It's a very short statement, and it's all there, and there are 3 clear things. And so far, the Morrison government has not delivered on them. And I know that there are some people, in the Indigenous community who are hopeful that he's kind of, warming up to the task, and there's certainly a realist view that it was never likely to happen in this term of COVID. I think that's fairly legitimate, but I don't know. Scott Morrison's never shown any great desire to do anything, and he's certainly shown no great desire to do anything difficult. As soon as something becomes difficult, as soon as somebody puts up some resistance, he tends to back away from it. And so I can't see how he will ever have the willingness to take a case like that to the Australian people. So it's going to require some determination on the part of a Prime Minister, I think.
Yeah. Harry Turner makes the point that there's a clear he has a focus on minimising political risk, the premise being that you take credit wherever possible and avoid blame otherwise, which thus ensuring a net positive political result. If that political approach is driving policy, the theoretical result is that government is not willing to pursue any risky or divisive policy, which we've just been discussing. Do you think this is the case, or do you think it'll change? And do you think it'll change back once Scott Morrison's no longer Prime Minister? That's a hypothetical, I guess. But do you think are there prospective leaders in either party who have a sufficiently clear set of policy objectives to overcome or balance the focus on political risk management?
So
I guess I guess the question is, can you see any way that politicians could avoid always focusing on risk management? So this sort of managerial culture that's taken over politics, we no longer have, what political theorists, would call various inspiring leadership or, ideas-driven leadership. I think Morrison's taken this kind of ideology-free approach to governing to a whole new level. But do you think it's permanent?
I mean, obviously, I hope not. There is an argument, and it's a fairly strong argument, that our fragmented, very speedy media cycle has made reform and arguing for reform very difficult. That said, I don't think it's over. No, I think I think if Kevin Rudd had more than one term, you would have seen some dramatic reforms really embedded. I think in Julia Gillard's term, you did see some dramatic reforms embedded. Even under the 8 years of this Liberal government, very, very, very little has been done. But gay marriage still got across the line, not in the way that it should have, but it got across the line. No, I think reforms are possible, absolutely. And I think there is a chance that after this pretty empty prime ministership, that both parties will have a sense of wanting to get on and do some things. So whether that's Scott Morrison returned with a party really pushing him to do some things, or whether that's Anthony Albanese wanting to do some things, I don't think it's permanent.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Um,
it might be wishful thinking.
there's so many questions here, and we've kind of run out of time. So I'm going to try and roll a bunch of them into one.
Okay.
How do you think the Labor Party, how would you advising, if you were the advisor again, you were in the office of the Labor leader, how do you fight a man like Scott Morrison? What do you think the opposition should be doing? As in, Christine here talks about Albanese giving a strong message today about aged care. Is this the way to go with specific campaigns that hit? Do you think fighting on principles? Do you think a small target strategy is the best? What would you be advising at this point?
Look, luckily that's not my job anymore. And any campaign advice ends up, comprising a huge number of detailed things. But my campaign advice to both parties would be the same at this point, and for much the same reason. I think there is a desire in the Australian community right now to know what's next and to have some sense of what the plans for that are. And both sides will use the word plan a lot in the lead up to the election. They've already begun, but that using the word doesn't mean there's a plan. I do think there is a desire among voters right now to know what's next. What do the next 3 years, what do the next 10 years look like? What do those parties want to do, and how are they going to go about it with a few specifics? And I think either side being willing to do that would help them an enormous amount. I think it is absolutely reasonable to say Labor has done more of that at the moment than the Morrison government, but not so much more that they can't be easily caught up to before the election. So I'm not sure either of them will take that advice, but it would be interesting if they did.
Yeah. Sean, I'm going to have to wrap it up. And so I want to thank you, firstly for your book, which, I just thought is just such an extraordinary piece of work to come out. I was really, really blown away by it, I have to say. It was such a kind of insightful piece of work. And like you say, it's almost like a piece of literary criticism. I think it really did change the landscape in the way that people regard the Prime Minister. So, thanks for that and for our discussion today. Sean's book is published by Black Ink, and it's available to borrow from the Geelong Regional Libraries in hard copy and ebook format. You can purchase the book, of course, from the local bookstores. Thank you, Sean, very much. On behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries, thank you, everyone. Sean, I'll give you the opportunity to say goodbye as well.
I just thank you very much, Nick, for hosting this, and thank you so much to everybody for coming and tuning in tonight. I really I think engaging with these questions is really great. I'm grateful.
Thank you so much, and good night.